Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. Please like, share, and subscribe. And to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Today, I'm joined by a good friend and comrade, Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, a scholar, writer, and organizer, to discuss his book, The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan, Fear, Desire, and Revolutionary Horizons, which was published by Pluto Press in 2022. Drawing on decades of political engagement and research, the book examines how hegemony is reproduced through everyday life, aspiration, fear, and desire, while also asking where transformative politics might emerge in contemporary Pakistan. We begin with Islamabad's Katchi Abadis, or informal settlements, and move through actually existing capitalism, middle-class aspiration, social reproduction, contemporary movements, the classless subject, and the challenge of building a national popular collective will. Welcome to the show, Aasim. How are you doing?
Sure, thank you for having me.
I want to begin with what's taking place in Islamabad today in terms of evictions. Your recent columns describe Katchi Abadis as being, again, under threat through legality, beautification, roads, and the future of capital. Can you describe the situation on the ground and why it speaks to the wider war on the poor?
Yes, I can. I mean, basically, like everywhere else in the post-colony, a vast majority of working class sort of populations living in big cities, not just mega cities, but increasingly cities like even Islamabad, which was never a big, huge mega city, but has grown exponentially in recent times as the agrarian sort of collapse continues. People continue to migrate. There's people migrating because of war. There's people migrating because of climate issues. And when they come to the city, of course, is totally dominated by an elitist planning paradigm, increasingly suburbanization based on speculative real estate. So they live in squatter settlements or slums or shanties or whatever you call them, which of course in Pakistan are called Katchi Abadis. And these settlements don't just sprout up overnight. They actually are part of an informal housing market in which state functionaries, facilitate this process because they receive under the table payments. There's often this incorrect assumption that people are living in these settlements for free. It's not true. It's just not a formally recognized settlement. And then from time to time, state policy demands that these settlements be bulldozed, despite the fact that, of course, as I said, low-level state functionaries themselves have facilitated their very existence. So in the last 6 to 8 months, basically this demolition sort of fetish has just reached epic proportions, and about 60,000 people have been evicted, and that's still about 10% of the total number. So this is an ongoing struggle and resistance in various ways, but the scale and the violence that the city government, of course, the government at large that oversees it is waging is as you say, it reflects a sort of an uptick. There's an intensification of class war, and that speaks to broader crises of post-colonial capitalism, where there's no other way to make money other than to clear land for real estate, and also just to the sheer brutal nature of state and class power, which despite the fact that these are people who are contributing and making the city run on an everyday basis, they are expendable, and that's what's happening.
Can you expand a little bit about what is taking place on the ground in terms of residents and how they're resisting these efforts to demolish their homes?
Well, I mean, they're not always successfully resisting. As I said, 50,000 people have already been evicted. So, there are attempts, and there are on occasion that, there is a situation where we are able to push the bulldozers back and to force people come out, people sort of compel the authorities to retreat. But in many cases, the authorities just, literally they seal the area, they shut down internet signals, they, send in huge sort of battalions of police with tear gas and batons. And despite efforts to stop the evictions, that the people are not successful. Now, all of this is happening, mind you, in spite of the fact that we, based on an eviction that took place 11 years ago, 2015, had managed to secure some kind of legal injunctions against summary evictions. So that's what I meant about the intensification of this brutal form of state and class power. That there are legal injunctions that prevent the government from undertaking these evictions, and yet they're still taking place. So, the resistance involves invoking some of these legal injunctions, trying to gather people on the street when the bulldozers show up, trying to generate, as much, in a sense, solidarity across not the corporate media, because it simply just describes everyone as an encroacher or an illegal or even a threat to the security of the state that needs to be eliminated. But, within unconventional media or even within wider political circles. So, as I said, it's partially we've been able to stop some of these evictions, but on the whole, I can't make a claim that we are winning, because, as I said, tens of thousands of people have already lost their homes, and there's more evictions on the horizon.
In your earlier work on I-11, the Abadi was framed through war on terror, encroachment, and security. In your recent columns, the language shifts to legality and roads and development. What does this shift reveal about how the Abadis are repeatedly made into a problem?
No, I don't think there's any clear just departure. I think all of these nomenclatures and all of these justifications for violent evictions are, mutually reinforcing, right? It can be a security threat. It can, to the extent that it can be a threat of terror, which of course is this ubiquitous, nebulous thing which anyone and anything can be accused of. And then by the same token, it can be, well, this is a security matter, but this is also about development. This is also about beautification. This is also about, legality and doing things to attract tourists, or to encourage consumption, or to, improve mobility by building roads. So I don't think that these are things that are, so it's not as if 10 years ago there was something else happening and now there's something else happening. I think the underlying dynamics are the same, that we have a form or political economy which is jobless, where there's no industrial or manufacturing sort of expectation that you can absorb surplus populations or people who are being forced out of a crippled agrarian sector. And so it's all about land and accumulation through other sort of forms of hot capital. And that was the case 10 years ago. It's increasingly the case now. You can call it development, or you can justify the eviction on the basis of the fact that these people are security threats. These are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. And in your column, The War on the Poor, you write that roads have more rights than people. The laboring poor, they build, they clean, they guard, they drive, and they provide services to the city, but they also become an obstruction when the city imagines its future. What does this tell us about capitalism, planning, and value in Pakistan?
I mean, basically tells you that capitalism is barbarous, right? That you could simply very explicitly say, okay, there's a road that has a right to be created and constructed, and if 25,000 people need to be evicted to are in the way of the road, that tells you about the absurdity of how capital and its ideological sort of justifications are generated. Now, of course, there's all sorts of things when it comes to planning that there potentially an argument can be made that in some cases the city and its longer term planning needs require, let's say, a settlement to be moved. Well, then in that case, even then there's some broadly through struggle, people have established precedents where, okay, well, then you resettle people, you give people alternative housing, you make sure that that housing is close enough to or proximate to their place of work. And that doesn't happen here, right? So the fact that there's a road being built and a settlement is being evicted for that process is one part of the story. The fact that then there's no accommodation made for the fact that, okay, if we are going to remove these people, then where do they go? They will somehow magically disappear, or they are cretins who will be swallowed up by the earth. There's nothing else that is a part of the narrative. So I think that, as I said, it tells you about a capitalism that is increasingly brutal, violent, no longer able to, back in the day, there was a capitalism, led by the so-called national bourgeoisie, which sort of the idea, the idealized form of which was like, okay, we might be evicting people out of the agrarian sector to build dams or something, but then we're also creating a manufacturing sector which will absorb them, right? And then maybe some kind of welfare sort of apparatus which provides some form of housing or something. More in the West, but certainly there were at least this could be part of the mainstream discourse in the post-colony. But I think that's completely disappeared now, right? So now it's just simply there's development, there is security, and everything else is expendable. Not just people, also nature, in the service of these sort of gods of you know of sort of the system. So I think it tells us basically that the system is, and this is Islamabad, this is the center of the country, this is a metropolitan region, this is not one of the brutalized, war-ravaged peripheries. But basically what we're seeing is that peripheralization is traveling to the center in more or less intense ways.
Yeah, in the preface to your book, you write the book is an empirical and theoretical sketch of actually existing capitalism in Pakistan. And I think that approach hasn't been utilized as much as it should have been in our context. Rather than beginning from an ideal model of capitalism and measuring Pakistan against it, you seem to start from the messy reality itself. What does Pakistan reveal about capitalism when we look beyond, factories, wages, or formal markets, and instead follow like patronage, land, debt, kinship, informality, and everyday survival?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's difficult for me to capture all of those dimensions in very succinctly. But yes, I mean, the point that you're making, I think, is can be basically understood as that, well, post-colonial capitalism has its own origins and has its own characteristics, and then I think requires theorization based on those own sort of, in a sense, historical, geographical story, rather than, oh, there is a capitalism that we imagine exists out there somewhere broadly in the Euro-American heartlands, or even in Japan, or even in, now the newly emergent centers of power of the world, China, and then everything in Pakistan or in India or in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka is measured up to that, or is, consciously or unconsciously uses that as a prototype. And I think that, mind you, I mean, this is not like theory of any kind, is based fundamentally on sort of actually existing empirical reality. So really what we're trying to understand is, okay, how, for instance, does a predominantly rural society urbanize? Does it urbanize, as I mentioned a little while ago, by absorbing large numbers of people displaced from that agrarian sector into a manufacturing sector? No, in our case, it doesn't. It simply has never been able to do that. Even at the high point of industrialization, as I mentioned, when there was this sort of idealized notion of a national bourgeoisie committed to import substitution and so on and so forth, even then, the numbers of people that we were being absorbed into manufacturing were a small proportion of the total. And so then what happens to this mass if it's not being absorbed into an ideal type factory setting? Well, what happens to that mass is it becomes incorporated into what we call the informal. I mean, I'm not a great fan of thinking about formal and informal in sort of binary ways, but into precarious or into non-traditional forms of work where wage, labor, capital, that classic relation doesn't necessarily play out. People may be self-employed. People may be vending a cart on the street, and that applies not just to their employment or to their work or to their forms of labor, but also to their forms of housing, as we're just discussing. So do you organize in the workplace? Do you organize in the residential neighborhood? Then all forms of politics also, I think, or what could be effective forms of politics also then have to be refracted through this empirical reality. So all it is to say, well, there is capitalism. It's a particularly colonial, brutish form of capitalism. It's certainly connected to global circuits of capital via the kinds of unequal exchange relationships that were established under formal colonial rule. That is all still absolutely accurate. But what does it actually look like? What is the first order problem that we are confronted with in terms of theorizing capitalism? I think is to be, I think it stares us in the face, and then it's up to us to make sense of it, and then, of course, to organize around it.
And in the book, you argue that Pakistan's a laboratory for neoliberalism. But the experiment is not only IMF programs, privatization, austerity, or corporate power, and you mentioned informality. It unfolds in, many micro level processes such as household survival, debt, informal work, migrant labor, and a bunch of other things. Does this show neoliberalism as more of a political rationality that becomes durable because people are forced to organize their life through its terms? Or even when those terms sort of deepen insecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's many things. I think at a discursive level, in terms of formal economic levers, certainly neoliberalism has been pretty uniform via the Washington Consensus across much of the post-colonial world. And I think you mentioned privatization, liberalization of trade and financial markets. So what little import substitution we had, what little sort of highly compromised, but what little places like Pakistan, other third world countries, it might be a little bit better. But whatever did happen in the 60s up to 70s and even into the 80s was then demobilized via debt and via prying everything up and allowing global capital to come and do its thing. And then, various kinds of comprador elements within. So that part of the story, I think, is certainly known and is also applicable. And certainly don't think that I depart from that. But I think there's also something to be said for some of the more prosaic parts of the story. So, for instance, let's take the idea that neoliberalism is understood to be some kind of unfettering of the market and sort of the private sector and so on and so forth vis-a-vis the state. I think that's too prosaic. I mean, neoliberalism in Pakistan functions via a predatory state, right? So this separation of state and private sort of sector, I think, is a bit overdone, right? So I think that, and that could be in, functionaries of the state, like the military, for instance, having this whole waft of its own corporate entities that both deploy state power in the service of its profiteering, but then also operate as entities that are sort of autonomous and private. So like the state capital sort of nexus, and that for me then allows us to think about how this is a longer historical story. It's not like state and capital under colonialism functioned independently of one another, right? The bourgeoisie or the colonial bourgeoisie was a bourgeoisie that occupied state power. They were fused in a sense. So I mean, I think that primarily I'm just thinking, well, neoliberalism needs to be identified for what it is, rather than just conforming to sort of a set of idealized characteristics. Some of them are very explicit and known, but some of them I think required more spelling out. And how does it actually look on the ground? And then of course that also looks like individuation, alienation, the breaking up of collective forms of struggle. I mean, trade unions or mass peasant organizations, again, were extremely influential in Pakistan, like many other parts of the third world. Probably not as influential as we tend to think, because again, unionization in a largely sort of informalized work setting is limited to begin with. But whatever did exist, that broke down. Student unions and sort of the ability of young people to mobilize through that modality broke down. I mean, one of the other things, of course, I trace in the book is digitalization, which I think is something that highly
which we'll be discussing more later in the interview.
Yeah. So that for me is also part of what we would call, the neoliberal sort of, in a sense, experiment in Pakistan, maybe a late stage of the neoliberal experiment. So I mean, there's again, it's impossible to bring everything to the fore, in sort of in quick time. But yeah, I think based on what we already know, that lots of work has been done about what neoliberalism looks like, and I think adding to that and adding more texture to how it actually looks, and maybe trying to break down some of the binary understandings that neoliberalism somehow reflects the withdrawal of the state. Yeah, maybe the state, insofar as the state had any leanings of welfarism or any kind of autonomous sovereign project vis-a-vis the world or the old imperial centers, but not in terms of the coercive apparatus of the state, not in terms of the state bourgeoisie, what Iqbal Ahmed once called the state bourgeoisie, right? The state functionaries that have their own sovereign project of accumulation to name and specify.
Yeah, I think one aspect of the book which I really appreciated was your treatment of middle class aspiration and understanding the middle class. And the book argues that most young people are imbued with a hegemonic middle class aspiration. But what I found different was you don't treat it as the aspiration as simply false consciousness or ideological manipulation. Drawing on Gramsci, it seems closer to a lived common sense. Why has this aspiration remained so durable even when its promises keep breaking down?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't believe in this thing called the middle class. So I think it's worth just bearing that in mind. Like, I think for me, middle class aspiration is an ideology, right? Is something that's out there to be hegemonized, or the system seeks to hegemonize it and make everybody feel like an individual, as I just said, alienated and able and willing to go and secure a idealized middle class lifestyle. And, the specific sort of conjuncture I'm looking at is one in which we have a very young population, again, something that's consistent across much of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, digitalized. So their aspirations are mediated by the fact they all have this gadget, and they all feel like, even though they don't have it, but they sort of can, it's there in their hands almost. It's something that they can potentially experience, or is very close to them in terms of how it reaches them, or how they can aspire to it, or how they can participate in spheres of aspirational living. And it is of course part of a wider sort of ideological shift, right? The neoliberal counter-revolution, where, as Thatcher says, there is no society, there are only individuals, everybody gets as much as they work hard, they get to play hard, and so on and so forth. And this is of course a global phenomenon. It's not just here. You don't have to be middle class, you don't have to actually have a particular kind of life to aspire to it. And I think that's what I'm looking at. And how does that aspiration become universally, in a sense, established and is out there for people to want? And yeah, and I think that for me then also explains when you don't get it, which most people don't. I mean, the American dream continues to be unrealizable for most working class Americans, but it's still very powerful and hegemonic, right? So what does that mean? That means you, in the absence of getting, you're meeting your desires. It's easy for a particularly conservative, reactionary form of politics based on fear mongering, based on some kind of othering, to be sold, right? Why aren't you becoming middle class? Why aren't you able to meet your aspirations? Because this immigrant, or this, Hindu conspirator from neighboring India, or this sort of internal enemy or internal other who is in Pakistan's case, who is against Islam and is against the nation, so on and so forth. I mean, these are old tropes, but this was a reproduction of this old sort of ideological sort of fear mongering for a young, digitally connected, aspiring population, right? So that's basically the story, or the canvas, that I'm seeking to set out. And then who are the actors? What are the names? Which are the parties? In Pakistan's case, there's always one established party, which is the military party, which then manipulates. I mean, the PTI and Imran Khan was the sort of, in a sense, the crystallization of this young, middle class, aspiring population, which, veers between fear and desire. But of course, the PTI since has been kicked out. And so, that population is still there. That population continues to in a sense to have its politics, its aspirations largely not overdetermined by, but largely shaped by by these hegemonic aspirations. And then, as I said, when you can't meet them, then there's someone to vilify. There's a paper tiger out there. So it's not false consciousness, it's lived. But of course, there's aspects of it where the paper tiger sort of becomes the target of your ire, your anger. And then, as I said, there's a whole separate sort of stories about why do digital mobilizations only go so far in helping us either move beyond the paper tiger, or just reproduce new paper tigers again and again.
Yeah, there's like a really Fanonian sort of stream in the book, and Fanon critiques the national bourgeoisie as something that inherits the privileges of decolonization without transforming the social order beneath it. In your book, when you're talking about middle class aspiration, it also appears through, things like property, education, migration, consumption, and incorporation in the existing order. Is this one of the reasons middle class becomes central to hegemony in Pakistan, because it translates freedom and advance within the same system rather than collective emancipation?
Yeah, again, I mean, like I said, I don't believe in this middle class stuff anyway. I think that the middle class is probably the biggest ideological obfuscation of the modern era, right? Like, what is the bourgeoisie? What was the bourgeois revolution? Even on the left, some for a long time, I think we were trained to think, okay, the bourgeoisie bourgeoisie has a particular historical, progressive historical role. It it ended the ancien regime, right? It ended the rule of the nobility and feudalism, right? And it ushered in democracy, and that's hogwash. The bourgeoisie never did any of that. All of that was done by the working class. The bourgeoisie conceded all democratic freedoms, the work week, minimum wages, franchise, the women's vote. In the West, I'm talking about, where the bourgeoisie is highly idealized. So I think that, and then in the colony, the middle class intellectual, the native intellectual who is supposed to lead the national movement, so on. So there's always been this supposed role of the middle class, right? And how does it actually look like? So that's what I'm saying. For me in this book, it's more of like an ideological category rather than, I'm not trying to empirically establish, is there one? How big is it? What does it look like? I'm sort of dealing with this long standing sort of ideological, this bludgeoning, like, blunt sort of anchor that continues to in a sense weigh us down, which is, okay, there is something out there. And in the case of this young working mass of people in contemporary Pakistan, which of course is unevenly developed across nations and geographies and genders, it does form like some kind of universal ideological category, right? That, oh, everybody can aspire in this way. So I think that, I think even in the Fanonian reading, there are times where the middle class has a historical role and then it deviates from it. When I'm trying to say, well, where is that historical role? Like, why are we wedded to the idea that there is a historical role? And in this day and age, certainly it's quite clear, because the neoliberal sort of, in a sense, miracle in the non-Western world was situated around this global middle class, right? India has a 300 million strong middle class. China has graduated hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. There's a big mythology about the non-Western middle class, right? And I think that's really, as an ideological claim, trying to sort of contest it and say, well, this is part of the problem in terms of shaping a meaningful emancipatory politics. We have to sort of really be able to confront this, and not just confront it now, but maybe trace its lineages to even, anti-colonialism, and think more deeply about, well, what is this phenomenon that we call the middle class?
Yeah. And in the book, you also look at, contractors, traders, transporters, and brokers, and those sort of figures. And you also challenge this clean division between the people and power. What does the multiplication of proletarian figures reveal about class formation in Pakistan?
Yeah, that particular segment, which I think is much more usefully understood as what, Michael Kalecki initially, and then Barbara Harris White and others have called the intermediate classes. And that was an empirical category, which reflected how, as capitalism penetrates into a largely agrarian sector, how small town economies, how petty producers, how a service sector develops, in which an intermediate class segment emerges, traders, merchants. And that was sort of Green Revolution, the Gulf migrations. That happened. And, going back 30, 40, 50 years, that segment of the population, which is a perhaps, a mobility from below story, is certainly not a progressive segment. It's generally been quite a reactionary segment, historically speaking. So, there's a social change story here. And I think what I'm looking at in the more recent book is sort of what happens with neoliberalism and so-called globalization, where that is an earlier story of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the intermediate segments, which represent clear change in the social order. And now I'm looking at a more globalized, digitally connected, young population, which may or may not actually be socially mobile, but it certainly has broader universal aspirations, right? So these are different moments. These are different historical moments. One is an earlier moment in the post-independence, 20, 30 years after formal independence. And there's another moment post-Cold War, into the late from the late 90s, early 2000s. And these are all historical moments that I think, if we sort of think through the longer arc of history, and we think, again, what is actually this middle class? One is, it's not uniform. It differs at different historical moments, different sort of origins, different kinds of political proclivities. So my interest is, again, in this particular book, is more about the younger generation of aspiring middle class subjects. It's about a political subject that is being deliberately fermented, and how then I think that subject needs to undergo some kind of self-transformation, Fanonian, Gramscian transformation of self, collective self, not just individual self, if we are going to recover some kind of emancipatory horizon.
And you engage critically with Partha Chatterjee's idea of politics of the governed. And just for our audience, while it captures how marginalized populations secure limited gains through negotiation, encroachment, you seem skeptical that these practices themselves can generate transformative politics. What is your critique of Chatterjee here? Do these forms of agency remain trapped within terms of the prevailing arrangements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, I think that, I mean, one doesn't want to paraphrase Chatterjee's work, and I don't think Chatterjee is making a claim that any of what he calls, the politics of the governed, or what, he's basically used this binary of civil and political society, and how most people in countries like India, his primary focus is India, but that could apply to, again, the informal sort of mass of people in countries like across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, how they negotiate, how they exercise political agency. So I would be surprised. I don't think Chatterjee would say that this is any kind of revolutionary politics, but this is politics, everyday politics. This is the politics of the governed. I don't disagree with the empirics of that story, but obviously in my case, I'm interested in thinking not just about what is, but how do you potentially recover some kind of revolutionary political horizon? So for me, I think there's some oversights in the Chatterjee story, both with regards to the binary nature of civil and political society, legal, illegal, formal, informal. Those sorts of binaries don't work for me. I don't find that useful. So empirically, I might agree with some stuff, but the way in which all of it is theorized, and less so Chatterjee and more the person that then I think has worked with Chatterjee, but who sort of spoke specifically about what he calls, the sort of post-colonial governmentality under post-colonial capitalism. His name was Kalyan Sanyal, and he talked about surplus populations. He talked about how people who are excluded then are brought back into the net of hegemony by giving them some kind of welfare. So that I find a bit overdone. I think a lot of people are just excluded. Right? We started with talking about these squatters in Islamabad. Islamabad is not, remote Balochistan or Pakhtunkhwa or some of our most brutalized peripheries. Islamabad, and if 500,000 people are being booted out of their shanties with no alternative, then there is no real welfare sort of corrective mechanism that keeps hegemony, in a sense, reproducing it, I think. So given that, then what are the prospects for thinking about revolutionary politics, about emancipatory politics? Yes, do people accommodate themselves to the system? Do they use patronage networks? Do they show up in and around elections and say, okay, you give us something and we'll give you your vote? Is it transactional? And those sorts of parts of the story, I think I can get my head around what Chatterjee or Sanyal are saying. But the other parts of the story that say this hegemony is very powerful, and I find it very volatile. I find the fact that this so-called global middle class, hundreds of millions of people in India are now, these are relatively well-to-do, savvy, probably educated people who are thinking cockroach Janta Party, right? Like this is not a stable hegemonic formation. So where are the revolutionary horizons that we can draw that sort of perhaps acknowledge what an everyday form of accommodation looks like, but recognize that everyday form of accommodation is not working for most people, even though they're trying. And then what are you left with? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this earlier, but in terms of contemporary hegemony, you've argued that it operates through a dialectic of fear and desire. Desire pulls people towards consumption, mobility, property, and respectability, but while fear produces threats, outsiders, and enemies. How does this interplay or dialectic of fear and desire help us understand the durability of hegemonic order in Pakistan?
Yeah, look, I think some of this is an old lineage, right, of state ideology where, you are a loyal citizen subject and, you potentially are rewarded for your loyalty. And that's then grafted upon a sort of a contemporary era, again, of digitalization, where now it's not just traditional forms of propaganda. Now everybody themselves is a propagandist, right, via their feeds and their posts and their, which of course has a separate problematic for me in terms of organizational politics. How do you create kind of collective discipline when everyone's out there being Plato and Socrates online? But I mean, the fear and desire is an old trope, right? That there is a loyal citizen subject, and if that citizen subject transgresses the established forms of desire that are allowed within the system, then you yourself become something. You are then suddenly banished and become a traitor or seditious yourself, right? And this has happened in Pakistan and in India and in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh with peripheral regions, with political dissidents, with the left, with all sorts of other sort of others. Progressive elements of different kinds. And it keeps happening today. And I think it's just happening in a more intense way now, because in the digital sphere, we consciously or unconsciously become the propagandist ourselves, right? What better evidence than when you saw basically a billion young people, mostly in India, but a lot in Pakistan too, basically vilifying each other at the service of their states in May 2025, right? So these are real life realities of how we are producing and reproducing hegemony ourselves. And I think that's basically, there's nothing new about it, but the form, the modality, and the scale, the depth, I think, are definitely qualitatively sort of more pronounced.
On a certain level, neoliberalism also operates by producing concrete forms of these desires and calculation and self activity rather than imposing obedience from above. Your account sort of seems to point in a similar direction. How do these everyday investments help reproduce sort of the hegemonic order, even when people are experiencing insecurity, exploitation, and downward mobility?
Yeah, I think that there's some of both, right? I don't think people are just disciplining themselves. I don't think that they're well-formed Foucauldian subjects, certainly. I think that their everyday the material terrain, which is exploitative, which is brutal, which they're confronting forms of repression all the time, are potentially also create the conditions for them to move in a direction of thinking deeply about and challenging the order itself, or, as I said, become fear-mongering, sort of flag-waving propagandists for the right or for the state or what have you. And I think that that's certainly, sure, it's deeply individuated, and I think the digital is making us more and more, I think, less and less self-reflexive, more and more slave to the algorithm and slave to the digitally crafted self and what we want, our followers to see, and the positions that we are expected to take, and and not just in politics, right? You think about how young people and their sense of self-worth, and there's the classic gendered sort of problematic about how a young girl has to feel beautiful, and if she's cussed out online, then she becomes completely convinced that she has no self-worth. I mean, these are now deep problems. They're not just individually created in terms of self-discipline. They are enforced by this whole material terrain that we occupy. So it's a bit of both sides of the two sides of that coin. And it is, as I said, it's deep. It is, I think, politically very demobilizing. It allows for fits of outrage politically without long-term ideological committed organizations coming out of it, which is the primary problematic that I'm confronting as I was writing this book, because I saw how even forms of progressive politics and organizing were completely being transformed by the digital. So there's a lot happening, and I think we are behind the eight ball and trying to think about it. I think part of the problem is that we are the time-space logic of digitalized capitalism is something that I don't think enough people on the progressive left are really taking stock of and stopping to collectively deliberate about. And, everyone is just out there trying to make themselves a hero online. And, that might be good in terms of maybe taking a brave position on certain set of issues, but I don't think it addresses our longer term problem of organizing a collective vehicle to change the system.
Yeah. And before turning directly to the classless subject and horizons, I want to stay with the question of political formation. If hegemony operates through the production and organization of desire, then counter-hegemonic politics cannot rely on critique alone. Grounded in the movements and struggles you discuss, what kinds of collective practices might generate different desires, different forms of solidarity, different ways of imagining a dignified life?
Yeah, I think that, look, I think that there's nothing the inherent problem is not that a young person wants to have a decent home to live in and wants dignity and wants to, because the only thing they know is, well, I need to have a car so I can drive on these roads, so I can be respectable, and so I can not be stopped by the police and harassed because I obviously look like I have no power and influence. I think the problem is the imagination of it is limited to what we see around us, right? That it has to be a gated housing scheme, and it has to be via these so-called Islamic banks, which are selling us this idea that somehow there's interest-free banking, and it has to be, through a cutthroat competition with the other your peer. So it's either you or him or her. And of course, that's what capitalism is everywhere. And so in that sense, we're not contending with anything different. I think the problematic that I see fundamentally is that the modality of thinking about these things and how to craft an alternative imaginary of what a dignified life could look like is absent, right? In the digital space, it's not happening. In fact, we're spending more time, I write in the book, that it's basically most progressives are competing about who's more oppressed. It's a competition of oppressions online. And, there's no dialectical understanding of, well, all of these things come together in the form of a totality, and it's called capitalism and patriarchy and national or racial oppression, and all of these things can be understood together. But so in a sense, a lot of it is about how to go offline, how to spend time physically engaging, both in terms of organizing with real people and then deliberating amongst ourselves as politically active sort of organizers. Okay, well, how are we building this organization? How are we contending with our differences? How are we going to expand, sure, even online support bases, but also offline? And I think that really is as simple and straightforward as it sounds. I think that is really, so there is almost a crisis of that, like, that there's less and less of that basic time and energy spent in sort of the offline setting amongst the people that you ostensibly share a worldview with. Because this isn't my individual, I'm not going to be an individual hero here by becoming a social media celebrity, right? I mean, I can become a social media celebrity, but I don't think that that's, as I said earlier, I don't think that that is serving the cause of building a collective political vehicle to
You
transform
may be
societies.
a social media celebrity and you don't know it.
I don't. Well, I mean, the point I was just this is more like I or anyone else can choose to do that. But the point is, how does it contribute to building a political organization that, mind you, of course, and this is quite aside from the fact that, what does online entail? Are we sort of saying, oh, here it is, here's all of our information and all of our data, and how do I become a celebrity? Is it because I'm really smart and bright, or is it because the algorithm has something to do with it? I mean, some of that form of self-reflection, I think, on the left is in order. Honestly, like, if we're not even able to do that much, then I'm very skeptical about what then our long-term horizon is.
I think that's a really interesting point, because the longer we stay online, we're being surveilled and we're being extracted from, in terms of the labor of being online, the value being created by staying online for so long. And I think the book also, you talk about the digitalized life world, and what I appreciated about that was how you treated it as separate from real, how you, rather than treating it as separate from real politics, you showed digital life as a part of how common sense, aspiration, anger, and political identity are now being formed. How has this changed the terrain on which workers, peasants, students, or various proletarian figures encounter politics?
Well, it's totally transformed it. And that's what I'm trying to say. I mean, partly the challenge is for us to sit down together collectively and make sense of it. As I said, I don't think that that's happened sufficiently. I don't think we've reckoned with it sufficiently. It's happened, and we've lived through it, and our forms of politics have evolved accordingly. And, every once in a while, people on the left will have a feel-good story that, well, Zoran won an election, for instance, by being an outsider who could do this. Sure. I mean, there's not a question of it's all good, or it's techno utopianism or techno dystopianism, whatever. But the point is, I don't think that there's a sufficient reckoning with, and that means also moving forward. I mean, when I wrote the book, I only mentioned in passing about AI in the last 12 to 18 months. I mean, what have we come to realize and understand about where AI is taking the world? And these are just tips of the iceberg. I mean, where are we going? What does the world look like? What are the terms of political freedom and emancipation and egalitarianism and all of the things that revolutions and revolutionaries have always stood for. What does it look like, in a world 5, 10, 15 years down the line? I think politically active people, for me, it feels like it's our responsibility to think about these things, to deliver. We don't have answers, but at least within our organizational ranks, to make this everyday debate, right? To make this about what is the balance between online and offline. How are we going to? What are the possibilities of? Man, I'm increasingly drawn again to the idea of sort of what do we think about as offline, meaning being off the grid entirely, or what in the back in the day was called underground. I mean, these are all things that at least should be on the table for us to be talking about, because
And
it
there are
seems
places.
evident. It seems self-evident to me that this is something that is a collective challenge more and more. And so that's really, obviously, 4 or 5 years ago when I was writing all of this down, it was like a primer to say, okay, someone's on the left thinking about these things. This is what I want them to be thinking about. And of course, those debates have proceeded further now. And yeah, for me, of course, the crux is still the material terrain, people organizing with people, not just resisting forever, also thinking about how to transform and contending with these newer modalities, especially digital modalities.
I appreciate that, because I think there are these discussions happening in various movements and circles across the globe. I think even especially in the global south, touching upon these things. In terms of like PTM or Earth March or ethnic national struggles in the context of Pakistan, they both reveal both the possibilities and limits of political formations today. They also open breaks in the national common sense, but the book also says resistance in its current online and offline forms is necessary but not sufficient for widespread social transformation. What separates these openings from the formation of a national popular will?
I mean, that's, of course, again, also a very long question, really, to spell out. But, I think that there's different things here. There's partly this is about how we communicate and how we come up with a horizon. I mean, I don't think that that can happen online. What does it look like? What is a transformed? What is socialism, or what is a society beyond capitalism look like today? Again, I think there's a lot of what happens in Pakistan and progressive movements is a lot of, we know what we're against. We're against a violent form of accumulation. We're against state repression. We're against various kinds of bigotry and xenophobia. And that some of that xenophobia happens within progressive circles too, for instance. But we don't really know what we're for. Okay, this is what we're against. What were we for? And of course, that's a big thing that the 20th century left had, even if it was a very idealized thing. But there was something out there you could say, oh, we want to be like this. This is where we want to go. So I think that is really the challenge. So that's, as you say, that a lot of these movements that we've been involved with and I've seen evolve and I've seen rise and fall, including on the digital sphere, that's their fundamental limitation. What the openings they reveal is that young people can come together and across, so it's not like PTM, when it first emerged, was not just a movement that appealed to Pashtuns. It is a movement that spoke to progressives across various ethnic national backgrounds. It has an internationalist flavor to it. Has it stayed that way? Probably not. Has it sort of retreated into more of a sort of a more, insular kind of worldview, perhaps? But the point is that these movements reveal possibilities, but you say they also reveal limitations. And I think for me, there's just no getting around the fact that in a country like Pakistan, the question of who are we across different regional, national, linguistic divisions has always been a huge challenge in this country. It remains one, so we have to confront it. Of course, for us, class and empire remain foundational questions, so we have to bring that into the picture. A young sort of generation of feminists have sort of reasserted, that patriarchy and gender oppression need to be part of whatever our progressive horizon is. Then there's ecology question. So there's many aspects to what a emancipatory horizon looks like. Again, my point is to flag what it is that the building blocks could be, rather than to sort of, completely provide a blueprint, because I think that happens through collective deliberation. That's partly what I think I'm imploring progressives to do, to make time to sit together and to work out what we are for, rather than just coming together from time to time and then fragmenting very quickly because we are only focusing about what we are against.
And a key component of your book when talking about the political horizon is the classless subject. What work is that concept doing for you It seems to be less about discovering a privileged revolutionary subject, which has been the sort of search, especially in our circles, and more about asking how different struggles, identities, and social locations can be articulated in a shared emancipatory project.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I position myself like so many others on the socialist or the communist left. We still imagine a world that is classless, potentially even stateless. So for me, the classless sort of moniker is important to recover as a horizon. That is the world we want. We want a world free of private property as we know it today. But of course, alongside the acknowledgement and the recognition that progressive politics has evolved in different ways, and identities of different kinds, race, gender, green movements, have largely enriched what left politics can be. And so, it is about the fact that it's a classless subject, is that in a sense is a play on words, where it's also a subject that is a gendered subject, a subject that is a racialized subject, or a subject that seeks to bring all of these different parts of the whole together. So that's really what it was. It was a play on words where I'm hearkening to a shared heritage, but also asking for those who maybe do not associate with that heritage to buy into a shared emancipatory horizon that also speaks to their more particular strict concerns, and while vesting it within some kind of universal.
Yeah, I think the concept sort of seems to refuse both like simple unity and permanent fragmentation. So it's like workers, peasants, or like surplus populations, or feminized labor, oppressed class, or ethnic national struggles, or ecological crisis. So many things I could list. It cannot be collapsed into one identity, but they also cannot remain politically isolated. What kind of relation in your mind?
We also can't take identity to its limits and just become just a bunch of fragmented subjects who don't have anything shared, right? So I mean, it's confronting the reality of what we've known to be the crisis of the left for 40 years now, and also saying, okay, but there's space for difference within that. It's not about, as you say, it's not a simple unity where difference must be flattened, but difference cannot be the catchphrase for endless fragmentation either.
The task ahead is described as a longish war of position and building of a Gramscian national popular collective will. What kind of organization can sustain those relations across difference without flattening them, as you're saying?
We need multiple kinds of organization, right? I mean, we have organizations that are mass organizations, for instance, things that I've worked on, organizations that, whether it be amongst peasantry or squatters that resist dispossession, that are ecological movements simultaneously. But we also need, I think, a political organization that predominantly, I think, my primary appeal is to really consider what digital has done to forms of politics, and to consider what it is that we now need to take back offline, because I think the online is now over determining what we're doing. So really, that's the other part of the story that I'm sort of asking us to collectively deliberate about.
Thank you for this conversation. That was our conversation with Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, author of Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan, Fear, Desire, and Revolutionary Horizons. We discussed Islamabad's Abadis, actually existing capitalism, middle class aspiration, fear, and desire, and the challenge of building a collective political project in Pakistan today. If you found this conversation meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe.